Hey Ferdy, have you heard of this new rock band called 1023 Megabytes? 1023 Megabytes? No, can't say I have. Oh yeah, they haven't had a gig yet.
Welcome to Headless WP Rocks. Today is an exciting day because we're building our first Headless WordPress application from start to finish. There's nothing to install, nothing to configure. You can build the whole app inside of a single CodeSandbox browser tab, and we're going to build the whole app in only about 45 minutes. If you're a web developer who has skills building traditional monolithic WordPress sites, but you've never built a headless app before and want to get a feel for what that's like, this is going to be an excellent video for you. The app we're going to build is called WPGraphQL Posts Finder. We're going to give the user a text input that they can type a search string into. When they do that, we're going to save that to React state and also fire off a network request to find posts on our headless WordPress backend that match that search term. When the results come back, we're going to take those results and then render them as a grid of cards on the page, and then the user from there can find the post that they're interested in and click on it to open that in a new tab. Toward the end of the exercise, we're going to find a performance problem, though, where every keystroke the user enters, we're firing off a separate network request. So we're going to see how we can debounce that user input and only fire off our request to the headless WordPress backend after the user's done typing, after a certain duration.
To get started with this project, head on over to this URL, codesandbox.io/s WPGraphQL Posts Finder, and then this is BLNCX, and this link will be included in the description of this YouTube video. Once you've done that, you should land on a very simple React application that looks like this. So you can see that we have just the base HTML file here that the page is built on. There's a very simple index.js, which just grabs the element with the ID of root and then renders the app component into that. I have some styles I've written for you ahead of time that also get imported into this file. And then lastly, we have our app component here, which doesn't do much at this point. It just has a wrapper div here with the class of app, and then our H1 that says WP-GraphQL Posts Finder. So with that, we are ready to roll. So let's take a look at our finished application and think about what we need to put in place in order to arrive at that final solution. So here we have an input for the user to type in their search query here. So we'll need to build that. The string that they type as well, we'll need to store that in some state. So we'll need to wire that up. We'll also need to fire off a GraphQL request. So after the user types, and then we store that value in state, we'll need to fire off the GraphQL request to get any matching posts. And then lastly, we'll need to render those posts on a grid like this with fallbacks for if there are no matches or if we're loading, things like that. So if I type gibberish here, we should get loading, and then no matching posts found, for example. So really 4, I think, primary things that we need to be concerned with implementing. So let's call this area of our application below the title that does all that stuff, let's call that our Posts Finder. So this will be a new component for us. So I'll type that in, Posts Finder, and we'll import that. And let's have that live inside of a new components directory as well. Just like that. All right, so we'll get an error since we haven't created that just yet. We'll grab Post Finder, and then inside of source, let's create a new directory called components. And then inside of that, our new file. So that'll be postfinder.js. All right, in here, we'll need to import React from React, and then we'll create that component that we just talked about. So Post Finder, there it is. All right, and then export default Post Finder. So in here, we'll need to do a few things like we talked about. So let's summarize those. So we'll do we need our text input that the user enters text into. We'll need to store the search query in state, like we talked about. Third thing was fire off GraphQL request to our WordPress backend. And then the last one would be when this request resolves to be display the results. So that'd be any of the matching posts. So from here, I think we can pick these things off one by one. So let's start with our text input, and then we'll store that in state, kind of the first two items here. So whenever we store anything in state in React, one of the two functions we can use is use state. So let's go ahead and use that for this, because it's a simple string of text. I think that'll be appropriate. So we'll call it search term, and then we'll do set search term, and then it'll be use state, and we'll initialize that to an empty string. And let's also import use state from React. So we can go ahead and work with that. All right, so now we have some state in which we can store our search term. So we've already handled our first item there. Let's wire up the text input though, so we can actually modify what's in that search term there. So to do that, let's return some markup. So this will be a form, and we'll go ahead and stick a few attributes on this form. So we'll do method equals post. We want some of our styles to apply. So we'll do class name equals search form, just like that. And then we want to prevent this form from being submitted in the traditional way on the web. So we'll do on submit equals, we'll grab the event. We'll do event.prevent default, just like that. All right, I'll give that a save. So now we're looking like this. Inside of the form element, now we need our actual text input. So let's add that next. This input will be a text field. So we'll put input type equals text, just like that. We'll need a few other properties as well. Next up, let's do what the value will be. So this will be a typical React controlled input here, where we'll take the current value of search term and make that the value. And then each time the value changes, when the onChange event is fired, then we'll call set search term to update it in state. So the value, as I said, will be the search term, just like that. And then we'll need an onChange. So when a change occurs, we'll take the event.target.value, and we'll call set search term to set it with that, just like that. Last thing is we'll just add a placeholder. We will say search for blog posts. So that looks great. Next, I think we should put this markup here inside of its own component though. So inside of components here, let's create a new one, and we'll call that search form. So we will import React from React. We'll call our component search form. All right, and then export search form as the default. All right, so in here then, this is where we can just copy and paste all the JSX we had written here. We'll copy that and paste it into this component. And of course, it's missing a few things. It needs search term and then set search term as props. So let's go ahead and pass those into it. So there we go. Now it should have the two props that it needs, and it renders out the form. Back in Post Finder, instead of all this stuff, we instead just need to render our search form component now. All right, so let's import it. And then instead of all this, we'll call search form. But remember, it needs these two as props. So we'll grab these two. There we go. So I think we've nailed this item on our list as well. So now we have our text input, and when a user types in it, it is storing that in state. So the next thing we're going to get into is actually firing off that GraphQL request. Before we do that, though, we need a way of sending and receiving GraphQL requests in the first place. But one of the easiest ways to do that is to use Apollo Client. So that's the library that we're going to be setting up next. To learn how to get started, let's head over here to the Apollo Client Get Started page in the documentation. So this page starts with the installation step, and it says you need these two packages from npm to get started. So if you're working on this project in a local dev environment, you could run this command to install them. For us, because we're working in CodeSandbox, I'll just copy these one by one, and then we'll add them as dependencies. So I'll paste in Apollo Client, hit enter, and I'll go back and grab GraphQL as well. All right, so now we have both of those, and we're ready to keep rolling. All right, so the first step is to create a client. So we need to do something like this. Ours will be identical, except instead of this URI, we'll be using our own for a WPGraphQL backend. So I'll go ahead and copy all of this, and in our project, we're going to create a new directory for that to live in. So inside of source, we'll create services, and then inside of services, we'll create apollo.js. Now I'll paste in what's on my clipboard. Right now, nothing's being exported though, and we'll need that to use it in another file. So let's go ahead and export that client that we're creating. And for the URL, we're actually going to use the WPGraphQL demo site. So let's see what that looks like. So if I go to demo.wpgraphql.com. So here it is. Here's the GraphQL demo site. This front end isn't used anywhere, but its GraphQL data is used to power all the examples on the WPGraphQL documentation site. So what we can do is use that and tack on a GraphQL endpoint at the end of it like this, and we can run our GraphQL queries against this and get real data back. So this is great. I will copy this, and then back in our project, we'll replace the old URI value with that new one.
Let's head back to the Apollo Client documentation. So if we scroll down a bit, we'll find this section, connect your client to React. So we'll need to do something very similar in our app. So we'll go ahead and copy this line, import Apollo Provider from Apollo Client. And back in our app, we'll find the app component and go ahead and import it. And we'll do a little extra cleanup here. All right, back to the documentation. Let's take a look at how we need to use that. So what we're going to do is wrap our whole application in this Apollo Provider, and we're going to pass to it as a prop our client that we created. So let's copy that line as well, and then back in our app component, we'll paste that in, and then have our closing tag right there. All right, so the last thing we're missing is this client then. So let's import that. Import client from, and we put that inside of the services folder, and then we called it apollo.js. So Apollo Provider here is using React context to provide the ability to run GraphQL queries from anywhere inside of our whole application component tree. So that means nested inside of Posts Finder somewhere where we need to run our queries, we'll be able to go ahead and do that.
Back to Posts Finder. So here we're rendering out our search form, and then whenever the user types into that search form, we're saving that value in state. Then it's just kind of hanging around there. We're doing nothing with this search term, really. So at this point, let's actually make use of that. We're going to add some new JSX here. So first, we'll add a new fragment like that. And then underneath this search form, let's have another component. This will be the new one that displays our list of posts underneath that search form. So this will be posts list. All right, and this new component needs to know about what the search term is in order to actually fire off the GraphQL request and know which posts to display on the list. So go ahead and pass that in as a prop. There we go. So this posts list we need to import as well. And the next step is to go ahead and create that now. So inside of components, we'll go to create file and post list react.js. So let's go ahead and import React, and then we'll create this posts list component. There we go. And now remember, we were passing in the search term as a prop, so let's go ahead and accept that. There we go. And for now, just to make sure everything's rendering, let's just return a p tag with that search term. There, so now that should work. So let me try this out. If I type something in here, there it is. So our state is being updated, and then it's also being passed into post list as a prop and then displayed here. So at this point, let's get started with firing off our GraphQL request to grab the matching posts. Let's head back over to the Apollo Client doc site here. And from where we left off, we'll go to fetching, and then we'll go to queries to see how we can query for some data from our GraphQL backend. So we'll scroll down a bit, and we'll see this executing a query section here. So this shows us what we need to do in a nutshell here. So let's copy all of this because we'll need to do something similar in our app, and we'll paste that here. All right, so for us, rather than get dogs, this will be get posts, like that. And then our query will look a bit different. We'll name our query the same as the const name here, just for consistency. Let's keep going with the documentation because we have to figure out how we're going to use query. So if we scroll down a bit more, we see this example. It says you can call use query, pass in your tagged template literal that you built up here with the query, and then get a few things back from it. So whether or not Apollo Client is loading, or it's in an error state, or we have actual usable data. Let's copy a few of these lines here. All right, so inside of our component, we'll need something like this. So instead of get dogs, since we renamed it, let's do get posts, like that. All right, so that's fine for now. Let's get back to this question of what are we actually querying for here. So to know what's even available to you in the GraphQL schema, you can use a tool like Graphical. So let me pop that open here. So it looks something like this. This is a free open source app. You can just Google Graphical, note the I right there, and then you can pop in any GraphQL endpoint here, and then see the schema that's available to you, all the fields and connections and so on, and you can build up your queries very easily. So inside of this, let me paste in that demo.wpgraphql.com endpoint that we were curious about. I'll pop that in here, and then we'll delete this text, and we'll start building our query. So we'll call it get posts as we had before. And now from here, you can hit Control Space to get a list of anything that you can autocomplete. So here, if you want to drill down to posts, for instance, you can do posts like that. And on each post, we'll grab the nodes, and for each node, we'll get the database ID, aka the post ID for that post. We'll grab its title. How about its content? So now that I've built that up, I'll hit the play button to actually execute this. And there you go. You can see I'm getting posts back here from our backend. So for this project, we're actually going to search for posts. We're not just going to get a list of all of them. We're going to need to only get certain posts. So the question is, how are we going to do that? So instead of get posts, for us, it'll be search posts, really. And for posts right here, we'll need additional arguments. Thankfully, there is a where query argument that we can pass in. So we'll do where, colon, and then curly's. And at this point, we can search for certain things. So there's a search parameter available to us. So we'll do search. I know the word align is in a few of the post titles. So we'll search for posts that have align only, for instance. And we'll just, to keep things clean, we'll do database and title only. So when I search, there we go. You can see I'm getting only the posts that have align back. So that is great. This is what we need. You can see, however, that I've hard-coded align, though. How do we get this to be a variable so that we can pass into it whatever the user had typed in our search input, right? So the way to do that in GraphQL is to accept a argument at this level and give it a name. So we'll say this will be our search term. And we'll need to prefix that with a $sign, just like this. You have to tell GraphQL what the type is going to be. So for this, it'll be a capital S string. And to say that it's required, meaning that this query can't run unless something is passed in for that, we'll tack on an exclamation point on the end. Now we can go ahead and make use of this variable inside of our query. So instead of hard coding a line here, we'll actually paste in our search term, just like that. And you can simulate passing in variables to your query by expanding this area here. So if I click and drag on query variables and just open up an object like this, I'll do my control space trick again to open what my autocomplete options are. You can see search term is the only one that it's picking up from our query. So I'll hit enter right there. And now the search term, I can type something else. So I'll type GraphQL now for our search term, and we'll fire it off. So you can see that this string will be passed into our query as its search term, and that'll be used to actually perform the query. All right, so here we go. So here are posts with that have GraphQL in them. Cool, this looks great. So for our project, we're going to need more than just database and title though. So let's grab the rest of the data that we need. So we will get the link, the author, and we'll need to drill down a little bit inside of author. Inside of author, there's a node, and then on that node, there's all kinds of info about that author, but we really just need their name. We're just going to list who wrote that post. And then next, we're going to need the featured image. So grab featured image. Okay, likewise, inside of that, there's a node. And then inside of this node, there is source URL. So that's where the image actually lives. And we'll grab the alt text as well to display. And that should be it for this application. So let's run our query one more time. Let's say something else here. Let's say post with the in them. How about? That should be a lot of them. All right, so let's make sure that all our data is coming back properly. So I'm getting post IDs, I'm getting titles, links, here's the author's name. Now featured image is null, but that's actually expected for posts that don't have a featured image. So we'll scroll down a bit just to make sure they're coming through for posts that do have them, and sure enough, here's a featured image, and the source URL is present along with the alt text. So to keep that in mind, sometimes we will have a featured image with those details, or otherwise it'll be null if there isn't one. So that's looking pretty good to me. So we can go ahead and highlight all of this and go ahead and copy it, and back in our application, this is what we'll paste into our GraphQL query. So back in our app, as I said, rather than just get posts, let's actually rename this search. That'll be more appropriate. So search posts, and now I'll paste in everything I got. There we go. So I'll hit save. Okay, so now our app is rendering, and we're kind of stuck in a loading state here. And that's because we have a problem, and that is that our query that we've built up here requires that we pass in this search term string. But as you can see, we're passing in nothing. All we're saying is, I want to use this query. Here it is, go. And not passing in any parameters at all. So let's go ahead and do that next. So you can add a comma after this, and then an object, and type variables, colon, and then inside of curly's here, this will be, whatever the key is for that variable you'd like to pass in, and then whatever the value is in that format. So for us, we're going to pass in the search term, just like that, and the key and then the variable we're referencing are the same. So we can just leave it just like that. For our next step, let's go ahead and render out different things for every possible state. So we'll address loading, we'll address error, and then if there is data, but it's an empty array, like if no posts were found, we need to address that case. And also if there is data and there are posts in that array, we actually have posts to display. So we really have four cases to address here. So a few of them we had copied in from the Apollo Client docs. So for loading, we're going to return this string. So let's modify that slightly. Instead, we'll just make it a paragraph tag. just like that. That'll be fine. And then error, we'll do something similar. We'll say error. We'll do error frowny face. There we go. All right, so we've handled those two cases. Now let's talk about the other two. So I mentioned if data doesn't have anything inside of it, if it has an empty array, we'll need to address that case. So let's do that now. So create a posts found variable like this, and we'll say we'll need to drill down to data.posts.nodes.length. So if that thing is truthy, then we'll know that posts were found. So we'll just do a double bang right there to see if that's truthy. And one other thing we need to do is make sure it's safe to drill down to this level. Let's use optional chaining here and just put a single question mark. All right, so if that is truthy, we'll know posts were found and we can render them. Otherwise, we'll need a fallback case. So let's handle that fallback case. We'll say if not posts found, what are we going to do in that case? So we'll just return another paragraph tag, similar to what we did in these cases above here, and simply say no matching posts found, just like that. So I think we're ready for our final state that we need to address, and that is if we actually have posts available to us. So we'll get rid of this search term is thing here, and instead we'll render something else. All right, so let's do a wrapper div first of all, and for styling purposes, we'll give that a class name. We'll call it posts list. There we go. All right, and we'll close that div. Now inside of this, we should be able to map over each of our posts and display those. So we'll pop open some curlies and we'll do, it'll actually be the same as this, so data.posts.nodes. That's what we want to map over. We'll just need to remove the question mark right here. All right, so those nodes we can do .map, and we'll say for each post then, we want to render something. So for here, just to make sure everything's working out, let's just do a paragraph tag and we'll do the post title. Let me reload my app here. Beautiful, there we go. So you can see we're getting, right now because there is no search term, we're just searching based on an empty string. So we're getting all posts back like that. Let's search for the word align again and see if a few of these go away. So ALIGN, and there we go. You can see our search is actually working. So when the user enters something new here, we're firing off a brand new GraphQL request and grabbing only the posts that match that. And also we're gonna want to render more than just the post title here. We're gonna render a component that we call our post card. So that's how we're gonna arrive at each of these cards that we display on the list in our finished application. So let's create that next. So instead of this p tag here, let's render a new component called post card. And this post card will need a key, as we said, just so React knows which is which. So this has to be something unique to the post. So thankfully for us, we have post.database ID, just like that. That's always going to be unique, and it'll identify which post is which. And from there, we can do post and pass that in as a prop as well, and have a closing tag there. So get rid of our old paragraph with the title in it, and instead, this is what we're going to be rendering. All right, we'll need an import statement at the top. And now it's our job to go create that next. So inside of components, let's create postcard. So create file, postcard.js. Okay, I've created the postcard component here. And remember, we were passing to this a prop called post with that posts data. And from here, we'll be able to render out all the markup to create each of the individual cards. So let's start by destructuring some of this data. we'll need to pull off quite a bit from this post object. We'll open up some curlies like that, and we'll destructure the title for the post. We'll grab the date. We'll get the link. We'll get author. And remember, this one was nested, so we'll need to drill down a bit further into author and do node, another set of curlies, and then finally here, this will be name. And we could just leave it as name, but just to be even more clear with our naming, I'm just going to rename that to author name. All right, so go ahead and do that. And last one is the featured image, like that. Okay, I think that'll be all of them. So now that we've destructured that data, let's actually return our postcard. So here we'll have a div, and for styles to be applied, we'll go ahead and apply a class name of post-card, just like that. And we'll close our div. All right, first thing we want to have, if you look at our finished application, is the image. So some of these don't have an image, as we've said. Others do, though. So you can see this one at the top. So we can check for that. With a simple ternary here, we can say if featured image is truthy, then we want to render an image for that. So we'll do img source equals, and the source for that would be the featured image .node .source URL, like that. All right, and the other prop we would need to pass in is the alt text. And then alt text would be featured image .node .alt text. So we'll copy this and put alt text at the end. All right, and now we need our else clause here. Otherwise, if that's not the case, render null. And then next we'll create a linked title. So here we'll say ahref equals, and we'll put the link to the post there, and then we'll close out our link, so just like that. And then in between these two tags, we'll display the title of the post. So this will be, we'll use an h3 right here, and then inside of our h3 tags, we will render the title of the post. So I'm going to give that a save, and we'll just see kind of where we are. So even though we haven't used all of our variables, we'll just stop at this point. And my app on the right, I'll just give that a reload to start fresh. So there we go. Yeah, we're looking really good. At this point, we have each of our postcards is being rendered out, and we can see those that do have images. The images are being rendered, so that's great. And then we have our H3 titles right there, and each one of those is actually a link. So this is looking really good. Let's proceed with the rest of our markup here. So after the linked title, we want to apply a paragraph tag, and then inside of that, we're going to have the date. So we'll say, and then for the date, if we just display this as is, the format isn't ideal. So we can just have a little helper function in this file that we pass the date into, and it gives us something a bit more human readable back. You could use a date library to do something like this, but for us, we'll just create something a bit simpler. So we'll do const format date, and this will be a function that accepts a date and then instantiates a date object, and I'll pass the date into that, and then we'll need to call a method on that. So we'll say to date string. So let's try that out. So I'll copy format date, and then down here we will wrap date in that and see what we get back. There we go. That's a bit better, something more human readable for the date that the post was published. All right, so with that, let's move on to the next thing that we need here, and that will be the author's name. So here, we'll put author, and then inside of the curlies, we call that variable author name, just like that. So you can see those popping through. It's looking good. In our final application, we had the labels bolded just for a little differentiation. between, what's the label and then what's the data. So we can go ahead and apply that now as well. So inside of each of these, we can just wrap the labels right here in a span. So let's open that up and we'll give it a class so that our styles will be applied. So we'll call it span, class name equals, and the class name will be text bold, just like that. We'll close that span, and then right after the label. So at this point, let's take a look at our finished application. So I'll click this button to open it in a new window, so we can see it in its full glory here. So cool, WPGraphQL Post Finder. So as soon as it loads up, it just uses the empty string, just to query for all posts right here. Then you can search for others as well. So if I search for the word align again, boom, there it is. It queries the GraphQL backend and then re-renders as soon as it has posts there. That's great. If Apollo Client is loading, we get our loading message. That's great. And if I check gibberish like this, no matching posts found. So this is super cool. Everything is looking great, but we have a bug here. Not so much a bug, but a performance issue. It's going to be an interesting one to look into. So let's for a moment pop open the dev tools right here and take a look at our network tab. And we can see I have XHR highlighted here, so we can see how many requests are being fired when the user types. I'll type the word hello. How about? So HELLO. So you might expect that we would have one request if the user types that, but we had HELLO. So we had one GraphQL request for every single keystroke that the user entered here. We're firing off all these requests, and the first four, first four in this case, we don't actually even need. All we need is the final request to complete. And we might even have race conditions where if one of these earlier ones were to complete before the initial one did, maybe we'd have like a flicker in our UI where you'd have the results from hello being replaced with one of the, the results from one of the other requests, and then being replaced with another one. It's just not an ideal situation. So the solution is to debounce this. We're waiting till the user has finished typing for a certain number of milliseconds, and then we go ahead and fire off a single GraphQL request to our backend with the whole search string. So let's see how we can fix this performance issue in the last part of the video here. How do we implement this debounce situation like we talked about for our performance problem? So to do that, we're going to be pulling in a utility library called Lodash, which is a very popular library. You might be familiar. So I'll type Lodash right here in our dependencies and then hit enter to have that added to our project. And we'll import a function it has called debounce. All right, and we'll get it imported into our project like that. So let's see how we can make use of this. Now, your first instinct may be to do something like this. Maybe you think, well, what if we take debounce and then we tell it call set search term, but do that only after a certain threshold, like 300 milliseconds. And then we can call this function set search term debounced, something like that. And then you can tell search form, hey, when somebody enters new text and you're about to set the search term, instead of using this function, instead we'll pass in the debounced function, right? So that it only runs every 300 milliseconds. We may try that initially, but that is going to be problematic for us because that means the user won't even see the updates to what they typed in this field until after that delay. So to make it more pronounced, we could make it a full 2 seconds, for instance. So if I type a character, 1, 2, finally it appears here. So obviously this is a terrible user experience. We want the text the user is entering to be immediate. So that solution is not going to work for us. So how are we going to do this? Because we want search term to be updated immediately so that the search form shows what the user had entered here. But we also want our GraphQL requests to be debounced and delayed. So how are we going to wire that up? So we could do this a couple ways. The way we're going to do it here is store another piece of state. So instead of just the search term right here, we're going to store another one called debounced search term. So one will be used for displaying to the user, and the other will be used for querying. So we'll say debounce search term here, and then set debounced search term, like that. All right, and now we can set these independently. So let's create a new function called handle search term change. Like that. It will take in the new search term like that, and it will be responsible for setting both of these. So the search term that the user sees, we of course want to update that immediately so they get that visual feedback. Our debounced one though, how do we manage that? So this handle search term change, that's now what will be called from search form. And just for consistency, let's go ahead and rename that prop to match that. So we'll call it that, and then inside of our search form component, instead of set search term, let's go ahead and rename it to handle search term change, just for consistency there. So that's great. So now whenever the search term is changed, this will be called, and we can set our two pieces of state independently. One we're setting immediately. We still need to figure out how to set the second one here. So you may be inclined to do something like this. I'll just give it a poor name since we won't be saving this. So callback function equals debounce, and then we will take the name of the function we want to call, and then how often. So like 300 milliseconds. So now we have a debounced version of that function. And now this callback function, you might think, all right, cool, now we can call that callback function and pass to it the new search term. I'm done. But this won't work for us, unfortunately. If you try this, it won't work out, and that's because the function that debounce returns and that gets saved in this variable gets replaced on every single render. So every time the post finder component renders, a new function is returned from debounce here. So what do? How do we get this function to stick around, to transcend, renders of this component? So the answer to that is a utility React gives us called useMemo. We'll need to memoize that function. So we'll say useMemo up here. We'll pull that in from React. And then we're going to replace this line with a memoized debounced function now. So we'll say const, and I'll grab this. So this will be set debounce search term, but it'll be a memoized version of that function. And then that is what we will wrap in useMemo, just like that. This accepts an inline function. So I have an arrow function, and this is where we'll stick our debounce and then set debounce search term. So this we'll copy and we'll paste that inside of this function, and we'll put comma, and useMemo accepts a dependency array here to know how often this function should be replaced with a new one. For us, that'll be an empty dependency array, because our function we're calling doesn't have any arguments. There's no reason that it should change between renders. So we're good at this point. I will get rid of our old, callback function right here and give it a save so this gets formatted a bit better. So there we go. And our last step is to grab the set debounce search term, memoize that function, and ultimately that is what we will call at this point. Cool. So just to review our application now, so the user types something into the search field, and then handle search term change is called. The new search term is sent in right here, and we're updating two pieces of state, but doing it kind of in a disjointed way here. So we're calling this one immediately set search term so that they see their immediate visual feedback for what they're typing. And then the next one that we call is a memoized and debounced function that ultimately, after 300 milliseconds of pause, then it will call set debounce search term and set the search term we're using for querying to that new value. The last step, as you can see from the squiggly here, is to make use of that now. So when our queries are run inside of post list, we were previously using search term right there, and that's where we were getting our issue where every single keystroke triggered a network request. So now instead of that, we're going to use our debounced search term. So I'll copy that and then paste that in instead. So I'll give that file a save. And now in a new window, let's go ahead and open this up. And we'll take a look at this. So I'll open the network panel. We'll try this out. So our app loads up. There's just an empty string, so it grabs the post based on that. And then I search ALIGN. Great, you see a single GraphQL request. The variables were the word align right there. And then the response that came back were just those posts that include the word align on our list. So there you go. There's your finished React application. One cool thing too I haven't mentioned is that because we're using Apollo Client, we get a lot of caching for free. So if I type a new term here that we've never queried for before, like by, something like that, you see it was loading momentarily there. But now if I type a search term that we have used before, like align, it's instantaneous. And actually, if you look at the network panel, no request is even made because Apollo sees that we're running the same query with the same exact variables that we had previously. So it just pulls that data from its in-memory cache and just displays those immediately. The same would be true if we went back to having none of them like that, to having no search term. We would immediately get that the list that we had before because it's pulling from the cache. So it's pretty sweet. So at this point, you can pat yourself on the back. You have successfully built a application that uses a headless WordPress backend and uses WPGraphQL to pull data from that backend, and not any data, but to pull blog posts that match the search term the user typed in here, and then on the fly re-render this grid of posts right here with our post cards with all the details about that post, and then titles that link out to that blog post. So congratulations, and thanks a lot for coding along with me.
Did you like that? Go ahead and push that like button. Subscribe.